give it another minute or so, just so a few more folks can join. And thanks so much for joining us. We'll start in a second. Okay, well, I think we are about to kick things off here. So welcome everyone to the fourth event in the Climate Change AI webinar series under the theme of coastal adaptation to sea level rise. My name is Kelton Miner, and I'm a part of the Climate Change AI community team and also a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen Center for Social Data Science. Currently a visiting researcher here at UC Berkeley's Global Policy Laboratory. For those of you who are attending your first ever CCAI event. We are essentially an initiative that fosters impactful work at the intersection of climate change and machine learning by providing education and infrastructure, community building, and advancing conversation in this area. So if you are interested in kind of getting a general overview or flyover of the field, check out the CCAI website to access interactive summaries for each topic covered in the main Climate Change AI paper. We also host a lot of different conferences and events and workshops. So if you want to get more of a sense of kind of where the field is going and what the state of the art is, we encourage you to check out our workshops highlighting the latest work in this area. And we run these several times a year, and videos of all of these past events are available online. And just to kind of highlight the upcoming event at the end of this list, the International Conference on Machine Learning will be taking place in July of this year. And as a part of that, we have a workshop on tackling climate change with machine learning, which you are welcome to submit abstracts to. They are due on May 31st, so that's coming up really soon. But we really encourage for those of you who are interested in participating in this broader community to consider submitting to that. So as you are aware, one of CCAI's sort of main events that we host are these webinars, and this is a part of the webinar series today. You can actually access and watch all of the previous webinars online on the CCAI website. Focusing on spatial planning of low carbon cities with machine learning. This next webinar will take place in June, so check it out. And again, you can kind of access and view some of the previous webinars covering diverse topics in the space, ranging from the social cost of carbon to sort of equitable climate mitigation. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. Check it out on the webinars page. And if you are interested in actually meeting other people interested in this space, you can check out our sort of bi-weekly happy hours in the discussion forum and the many other opportunities and resources available on our website and our monthly newsletter, which includes open calls for funding, submissions, and links to readings and courses. So this is sort of like a great resource to just sort of find what's going on in the space, and also to track down different funding opportunities to sort of support your research. So this leads us to today's critical topic, coastal adaptation to sea level rise. Certainly sea level rise and discussions around it have been in the news a lot as of late. And the world's oceans have really long connected humanity via sea-based trade routes manifest in the port cities that dot coastlines globally. This legacy paired with mass urbanization has led to a growing proportion of the human population who call coastal cities home. And climate change is increasing flooding in many coastal areas and cities due to a combination of higher sea levels and more intense rainfall events, which paired with tidal flooding and other recurring natural hazards is increasing the extent to which people, households, and vital infrastructure, as well as social ecological systems, are exposed to flooding. And so this is where we sort of take the departure for today's talk. This increased risk and exposure to sea level rise raises questions that are critical for coastal adaptation and planning for the future, and for understanding the benefits of climate mitigation if future flooding can be avoided through actions that are undertaken today. So can new forms of social data enhance or complement existing methods for monitoring tidal flooding hazards beyond what is possible with existing tidal gauges? And can machine learning help us understand where and how many people are living on land threatened by rising sea levels, both now and in the future, by correcting for errors in satellite elevation data? So to delve into these questions, we have two stellar speakers joining us today, Dr. Francis Moore and Dr. Scott Kolp. And with that, we'll turn things over to our first speaker, Dr. Francis Moore, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science and Policy at the University of California, Davis. She works at the crossroads of climate science and environmental economics to better quantify the costs of climate change, to inform policy analysis and adaptation. Her recent work includes investigations of the use and non-use value of natural systems and large-scale analyses of the social remarkability of climate change, providing insights on the extent to which people can update their baselines of our environment as the sort of environments we live in and the climates that we are surrounded by shift away from what was previously normal. So in the spirit of highlighting interdisciplinary research that can help inspire future research in the climate adaptation and machine learning space, today Dr. Moore will talk about insights from her recent work using social media data to enhance monitoring of coastal flooding at scale. She will have 25 minutes to present, during which attendees can write questions in the chat, which will be processed by the CCAI team. We will ask a subset of these questions after both speakers conclude their talks in the final Q&A session. And so with that, Dr. Francis Moore, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Kelton, for that great introduction, and thank you to all the organizers for putting together this interesting session. So let me just share my screen. So today I'm going to talk about a project I've done in collaboration with Nick Obradovich, who is currently at, I don't remember his current affiliation, but he's really cool and he does a lot of work with social media data. So here what we're thinking about is this problem of kind of how do you measure and monitor kind of, minor to moderate coastal flooding. And so everyone here kind of knows that rising sea levels, right, are kind of one of the most, pretty well understood, kind of consequences of climate change. And I think sometimes if you think of rising sea levels, you think of this kind of gradual process, right, that kind of unfolds very steadily. But if you think about how rising sea levels kind of actually manifest in coastal areas, right, like it's not a gradual process because sea levels are not constant, right? In any given area, the sea level is going up and down. It goes up and down multiple times a day because of the tides. And then those tides themselves kind of have a seasonal pattern to them too, where they're kind of higher or lower at different times of the year. And then you have these really kind of extreme tides where due to a variety of kind of factors, you might have kind of very, very high tides. And it's those kind of high tides that kind of threaten coastal infrastructure through these kind of flooding events, right? Where you kind of exceed, some flooding threshold and the kind of water like spills onto the land. And that what rising sea levels do, it kind of makes these extreme events kind of more and more frequent, right? Because the baseline sea level rise is gradually rising. And so this is kind of if I talk about like kind of nuisance or like sunny day flooding, it's these kind of events, right? Where you have a high tide, like the water is kind of where it shouldn't be, right? And, but it's not super deep, right? It's not like washing away cars. It's not fast flowing and it's not necessarily kind of having a major flood in terms of destroying property. So these are common and they're becoming more common, these minor coastal flooding events, right? And so this is just taking data from tide gauges along the US East and Gulf Coast and looking at the average number of floods per month. And you can see it's going up, right? And that is exactly what we would expect because of climate change. And so even though it's kind of called nuisance or like minor flooding, like these things are consequential, right? And I think we shouldn't, and certainly if they happen frequently and they affect a large number of people, the aggregate cost of them could be really high, even if they're not super salient or each individual event is not a kind of major disaster, right? And so I'm just pulling out kind of two fairly recent papers. This first one is a case study of kind of these nuisance flooding events in downtown Annapolis, where they did a really kind of in-depth study of this one particular area, and in particular, like one parking lot, and looked at, firstly a whole, a really like difficult process, even just to identify the days on which there was flooding there, right? Because as I will describe, like that's not super easy to do. And then kind of showing that had a kind of, an effect on the revenues in the nearby businesses. And then this is a really recent study looking at kind of commuting patterns in Miami and how those are kind of affected by these increasingly frequent coastal flooding events, suggesting there's been a kind of overall increase in commute times of about 15 minutes over Miami over just the last 10 years due to these things, which that is a lot in terms of like an average effect over a large number of people. And then kind of, these like what, somewhat like anecdotal or like kind of reported cases of these things becoming frequent, becoming longer, and kind of causing people to take more and more costly action to kind of avoid being affected. But these events are kind of not easy. If you're trying to understand what is the frequency of these events over kind of what spatial scale and like how frequently are they happening and how disruptive are they, turns out like that's not easy to do, and we don't have great data on this, right? So the reason why, well, tide gauges are relatively sparse along the coast, right? And so here you're looking at like kind of the Gulf Coast and like Florida, and where the arrows are is where there's like no tide gauges, right? And you can see like there are some, right? So if you're trying to monitor like an average rate of sea level rise, you might do okay with these. But flooding is can be like a highly localized event, right? Depending on a lot of local factors, including, the local bathymetry, the local topography, local flood defenses, as well as more localized like atmospheric and hydrologic conditions that give rise to flooding in a particular place. And like these big gaps in the flood gauge in the tide gauge network are kind of not really conducive to measuring flooding at that localized level. In addition, once you start digging into this tide gauge data, what you quickly realize is that the flood thresholds, right? So you don't just want to know the tide height, you actually want to know, like, was this a flood or not? And so there are flood thresholds, but they are not well standardized across gauges. They are kind of set in a somewhat idiosyncratic manner by kind of regional managers. And they and what that means is like the definition of what either how frequently or how consequential a minor flood is across different gauges is not well standardized. And so a minor flood at one gauge might be really different in terms of its impact than a minor flood at another gauge. And also not all tide gauges have flood thresholds, right? So they're not even defined for a kind of a not small subset of these tide gauges. Other commonly used measures of flooding, things like which focus on damages, so that's things like insured losses, they're not going to capture these effects of moderate to minor flooding, right? So if we're thinking about these, disruptions, delays, kind of effects on people's behavior, avoidance behavior that are widespread, but not necessarily kind of acute and not necessarily monetary in nature. Like these measures are not going to be able to capture those effects. So what are we doing here? So social media data here is attractive for this problem for a number of reasons, right? So it's geographically widespread and temporally continuous, right? So kind of more or less people are tweeting kind of like, you're getting some kind of measure like every day, every hour. What's also cool about social media and why I particularly like it for these kind of applications is that it contains information. It implicitly contains information, not just about where water is, so kind of the extent of flooding, but the impact of that flooding, right? So if this busy road floods in the middle of the night versus if it floods at 9 a.m., those things are really different things, right? Like they have different consequences. And it's actually useful to have a measure that tells you that these two things are different things because of the consequences they have. And that's something that, like, just taking your more conventional kind of environmental monitoring tools, like, that's not going to tell you that, right? It's going to tell you was that water there or not. And then, in addition, the tweets, if you start digging into what people are actually saying, they contain information too about the actual impact people are facing. And so potentially it's a way to investigate these phenomenons across a wide area in a way that's kind of more standardized and contains more information than these more traditional environmental monitoring tools. Although, of course, we have to be, it does also contain its own perils and pitfalls too, that we might get into more in the Q&A. And so what we're doing here, in this study, we're using Twitter data to identify kind of county-specific flooding thresholds along the US East and Gulf Coast, and then we kind of compare them to what you might estimate given the tide gauge network to show how they compare. And so it's kind of a methodological development paper. And so what do we start with? Well, the key piece of the study is a Twitter data set. So we start with all tweets geolocated within the 235 shoreline counties along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. And this is between about kind of November 2014 to kind of the end of the year in 2016. We use a fairly simple, we identify tweets about flood if they contain a flood-related word. So it's a bag of words approach where we kind of just, have a set of words that we think are, about flooding, and we kind of count up the tweets in each county in each day that are about that contain one of these flood-related words. And then we merge with a bunch of hydrologic and atmospheric kind of variables, including the local tide gauge data. So we're matching each county to the nearest tide gauge on a population weighted basis. And so we have the tide gauge, and then we have its flood gauge thresholds if it's set, if they have them. Daily rainfall measures, as well as cumulative 5-day rainfall. And that's it. Oh, and we also have kind of county population and number of Twitter users and things like that too. And so what do we do with this data? Well, what we do is we try and kind of scan the set of, we try and identify a model of that explains the kind of flood related tweets coming out of each county. And we choose a kind of particular functional form that's able to capture both a threshold effect as well as a kind of more continuous response to increasing tide height. So the idea here is that below a certain level, right, there's no flooding, right? And so, because flooding is this kind of very nonlinear kind of translation of tide height. And so there's some thresholds, right? And above threshold we allow, but don't require there to be a kind of jump in the number of tweets, right? So it's like, suddenly there's water where there shouldn't be, right? So people start tweeting about that, as well as a more continuous increase in flood-related tweets in response to increasing tide height, right? So that, if the flood becomes more extensive or deeper or more consequential, then you're going to get more floods in related to that increasing tide height. And so for each shoreline, what we're trying to do then is we essentially do a kind of model fit exercise to try and estimate what this threshold is for each county. And so we for each county we fit a set of models that varies this tide height, this flood threshold between all possible tide heights in 10 centimeter increments, right? And so we kind of move that threshold up gradually and fit a new model where the new model is defined by beta 1 and beta 2. And then for each county, we choose the model with the parameters that best explain the time series of flood-related tweets, where that's defined by just minimizing the AIC. And then given that kind of best fit model, we define a noticeable threat. So we're not, when we don't just take the threshold, but we actually define a noticeable threshold, flooding threshold, which is defined by just a 25% increase in tweets, in flood-related tweets. And then we match that flood-related, that tide height of the noticeable flood threshold defined relative to that county's nearest tide gauge. And then we're kind of looking for these counties where that noticeable flood threshold is statistically different from the minor flood threshold at the tide gauge. And so these tide gauges have three flood thresholds, so minor, moderate, and major. And so we're thinking about this minor flood threshold that just indicates whether there's flooding or not. I'm sorry, I don't have a timer visible on my screen, so please stop me if I'm heading over time, but okay. And then we could include as controls the daily rainfall in that county, the 5-day cumulative daily rainfall, month fixed effects, and that controls partially for kind of seasonality or any kind of seasonality in flood-related tweets, unrelated to flooding, as well as the number of twitties over time. And so this map here is showing you all the counties along the east and Gulf Coast of the US. The red dots here are showing you the tide gauges that are in our data set. And then the gray areas are counties where usually because there's not enough Twitter data, essentially, these are mostly like more rural counties that we're not able to estimate. We're not able to fit a model. We don't have confidence that there's like enough data there to be able to fit a model. And so then the colored areas are ones where we do fit a model. We do kind of select a preferred model. And then the colors are showing you how that noticeable flood threshold differs from the flood threshold of the local tide gauges. And the blue areas are ones where we estimate there's more flooding than you would get from the local flood threshold, local tide gauge, and the brown ones are showing you places where there's not. And then the ones that are outlined are ones which are these where that difference is statistically different. And so these numbers are in terms of quantiles of the tide height distribution, because tidal ranges vary a lot across this region, and so a 20 centimeter difference is like means something very different in kind of Maine than it does in South Florida, like where the tides are much smaller. And so that's why we reference everything to that quantiles of the tide height to the tide height distribution. And so we find, sorry, I have to move my Zoom screen. So of these outlier counties, we identified 24 counties where this our estimated flood threshold is statistically different from the local tide gauge. And given, we have to be careful, we're doing a lot of statistical comparisons here, right? So we have to be careful about the number of false positives. But given the number of, that is, a lot different than the number of false positives that we would expect in expectation. And so in almost all, and these are not kind of random, right? So it's not that we find in some places there's more flooding and in some places there's less flooding, right? Almost all of these flooding is more common than would be suggested by the tide gauge, right? This minor flood threshold. And what I think is quite cool about this is we identify what drops out of this analysis are some geographic clusters of these outliers. And so, for example, you can see a whole bunch of them around in these counties around Boston. And then there's some kind of also along the kind of Texas Gulf Coast as well. And that's not, to me, that's reassuring in the sense that these statistical fits are done independently by county, right? So we're not kind of using information from neighboring counties. But we think in real life, right, that there is spatial correlation kind of across counties, and the fact that we recover that even though we're fitting and selecting these models independently, to me is kind of suggests that we're capturing something real, at least in like some of these areas. Okay. So, sorry, slow down my mom. So this is showing you a summary of our estimated fitted response functions for just pulling out some of these counties. And here I've chosen counties either that are kind of important in terms of their population, or where we're identifying these clusters where we've got a couple neighboring counties that are both identified as outliers. And so let me just talk you through what these graphs are showing. So first, if you first focus on Miami-Dade, the Miami-Dade graph here, what I'm showing you is our fitted response function here in gray, with the 95% confidence shown kind of shaded around it. And so you can see how we estimated the threshold here. And then the dashed line is showing you a noticeable flood gauge threshold, right? So this is the 25% increase in flood-related tweets. The dotted lines in each graph is showing you the tide gauge. So this is for our matched tide gauge, kind of what does that tide gauge think of as a minor flood, right? So you can start to see kind of why, we identify Miami as an outlier where people are starting to tweet about flooding kind of at a much lower tide height than suggested by the minor flood threshold, right? Which corresponding to more frequent flooding, right? Because that threshold is exceeded kind of more frequently. There are other examples too, and this is another kind of interesting case here. This is Wilmington, the Wilmington area in North Carolina. And here's a case where we identify flooding happening less common than the tide gauge. So the tide gauge here actually kind of reports minor floods happening almost every week. Whereas we would suggest, like, instead those noticeable floods are actually happening maybe once every 2 weeks, right? So really significantly fewer flood events happening in this area. And when I started to dig into this particular tide gauge, there's actually been written from people that manage the tide gauges that know there's been documents, it shows up in reports as having a spuriously low tide gauge threshold, and that at very low, at this minor flood threshold, what's happening is flooding is going on to kind of flooding a field essentially, and so it's quite it's not very consequential. So water is on land, but is it kind of consequential in the sense that of what we're capturing here of a noticeable flood? The answer is no, right? And so that again is reassuring that we're picking up something kind of real. The final kind of case study that I want to talk about is the Texas coast example here. And so what's interesting for these counties is that, again, we've pulled out a cluster, right? So we've identified a couple neighboring counties where we identify flooding happening frequently. And what's going on in these counties, this tide gauge in our entire record, there is never a tide height that exceeds the flooding threshold, right? So you can see that the flood threshold here sits kind of outside this range, and where this is the observed range of tide heights. And so I dug more into what's cool about the Twitter data. You can actually kind of go in and pull out the relevant data, the relevant tweets, and actually look at what people are saying. And so I did that for these counties, and I kind of read through these flood-related tweets that come from these counties on these flood days. And so these areas of the Texas coast are identified as flooding frequently, but there's no official floods on record at the tide gauge. And what the tweets show is that this flooding is associated with rainfall events, right? But statistically, we pick out a clear statistical association with high tides, right? Even controlling for very heavy rain events and kind of extremes in the rainfall distribution. So what's almost certainly going on here is that the very high tides are slowing drainage through the storm drainage infrastructure. And you're getting this interaction effect where the flooding is being driven by this combination of heavy rainfall and high tide. What's interesting about this is that, well, both those things are expected to increase with climate change, right? We're going to get higher tides and we're going to get more intense rainfall events. And so the interaction of those two extremes is probably pretty significant in terms of increasing the frequency of flooding in these neighborhoods, but you're not going to pick it up just by looking at rainfall, and you're not going to pick it up just by looking at tides. And so this is what kind of the climate science literature sometimes refers to as kind of compound extreme events, where they're being driven by the interaction of two, unusual events. I just want to talk a minute about where we're going with this, because we are slowly trying to do more on this work and kind of do some things that are more sophisticated. So we now, and in particular, I think, given what I just described about that Texas case study, I think we're interested in trying to generalize this method to explain and potentially project urban flooding more generally. And this is really tricky because one reason is climate models are notoriously not great at simulating rainfall, and in particular simulating kind of extreme rainfall, which is one of the major consequences of climate change. And so potentially this approach, using social media to inform you when these events are happening, can be used as a complement with these more traditional kind of environmental monitoring and environmental science tools to tell you a lot about these urban flooding events. And so here we've got a much longer Twitter record. So now our Twitter record is like twice as long because many years have passed. We have a more sophisticated flood detection algorithm. And so I've worked with my colleague at Davis, Tyler Scott, who does a lot of natural language processing of mostly of like regulatory documents. It's like most of his work, but he's kind of using more like neural network approaches to classify these flood-related tweets. And then using a time series anomaly detection algorithm to actually identify which days are flooding, rather than assuming the functional form that I just showed you. And then eventually, if I can ever get this research funded, we will partner with climate scientists to pull out atmospheric measures of intense rainfall, hydrologic drivers, things like storm surge and atmospheric pressure and river stage, right? So all these things that go into these compound events that might differ, they might be really different, right? These, what's causing flooding in one area, in one city versus another. So we're going to kind of use the flood days identified from Twitter in combination with this kind of rich atmospheric and hydrologic data set and kind of use machine learning methods to then identify the combinations of drivers and thresholds that are leading to flooding in urban areas. And so this is just showing you an initial example of like some of that work where this is showing you the fraction of flood-related tweets for two kind of medium-sized, like metro areas on the East Coast. And what's cool about this work is, I think you can imagine Miami going and, like sponsoring a dedicated, like high-level, like scientific study, right, to really like key in on like what their flood risk looks like. It's harder to imagine a town like Virginia Beach like doing the same thing, right? And so having these highly tailored in the sense that they're really modeling, the flooding that's happening in that location, but also easily generalizable kind of methods that rely on these model fitting kind of machine learning approaches. I think is like, that's what to me is kind of cool. And so what you're seeing here is the yellow kind of diamonds are these days that are identified as like anomalies in this time series. And so presumably those are days when flooding is happening at that in that city, although we have to do a little bit of kind of checking on that still. And then the dashed green lines are the days identified as minor flooding events at the nearby tide gauge. And so you can see that we're picking up some events that like really correspond to the tidal flooding threshold. But we're also picking up a lot of events that don't, right? Like here or like here. And there are tidal flooding events that don't correspond to kind of Twitter flooding events, right? And so what's going on with those? Maybe it's happening in the middle of the night, right? Maybe something else is going on. And so that's the idea. So conclusions. So sea level rise, the coastal flooding is increasingly common. And we have these kind of, case studies, as well as kind of anecdotes and news reports suggesting it's disruptive and costly, but it's surprisingly poorly measured by standard environmental monitoring tools. Social media data, for reasons I described, can provide a useful complement to these more traditional environmental monitoring tools. And then based on, this initial work on the US Eastern Gulf Coast suggests flooding is substantially more common than the tide gauge data would indicate. And further work could kind of use these approaches that combine social media data with these kind of sophisticated climate, atmospheric, and hydrologic data sets and models in order to kind of understand the current drivers of these compound extreme events, as well as project them into the future.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dr. Moore, for the super inspiring and interesting presentation. So we're going to hold questions for now, but please continue to run into the chat and we will make sure to address them at the end here. So here we are. We are going to transition to our next speaker now. So it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Scott Kolp, who is the Principal Computational Scientist at Climate Central in Princeton, New Jersey, where his research interests include the impacts of sea level rise on coastal communities. Scott received his PhD in computer science from Rutgers University and currently leads Climate Central's Coastal Dam project, which has received international attention. Just to provide one metric, his team's 2019 paper entitled New Elevation Data, Triple Estimates of Global Vulnerability to Sea Level Rise and Coastal Flooding has been accessed over 520,000 times. So right on cue, his team just this week published a related paper in Nature Communications, finding that over $8 billion of the damage dealt by Hurricane Sandy can be attributed to sea level rise due to human-caused emissions. We look forward to learning about this work and much more during his talk. So thanks for joining us, Dr. Kolp, and take it away.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, is that showing up all right? Okay. So yes, I'm Scott Kolp. I'm the principal computational scientist at Climate Central. Climate Central is a nonprofit climate research and journalism organization. And here I'm presenting a project that we've been working on for several years. Now at Climate Central, we are interested in just educating the general public, to kind of essentially translating the science, about climate change to make it more understandable to the public and why people should, care and why it matters. And so we try to, keep it local. And so in the sea level rise program, we are essentially kind of interpreting those sea level rise projections and coastal flooding projections that are released all the time, and translating that into how that actually impacts people around the world. Now, at the core of these vulnerability analysis, where we're trying to understand which places are vulnerable to flooding, is the digital elevation model. And that's an elevation model is really just a map of elevation. So each pixel might be estimate the altitude of at that location. So that way, with an elevation model, we can kind of predict, if sea levels rise by a meter, if we have a location that's an altitude of 0.5 meter, then it might be vulnerable to sea level rise. So this is very, very important to our research. In parts of the world, such as the US and a few other countries, high quality LiDAR derived elevation models are available, and they kind of can they essentially fly a plane and shoot lasers down on the ground, and they can measure the elevation of land underneath like trees and houses. But the problem is we want to measure this vulnerability at global scales. And right now, the global scale elevation models use satellite radar technology. And what happens is they actually see the tops of like trees and buildings as land, right? So you can imagine if you have like a city with a bunch of skyscrapers, you know, it sees the skyscrapers as big, a giant mountain. And that's a problem, right? And it was specifically the most commonly used global elevation model is NASA's SRTM. And on average, it estimates elevations like 2 meters higher, too high. And when you have sea level rise projections of like about 1 meter by end of century, that's gonna be a big problem. It's even worse in cities. So our goal here is to develop a new elevation model at a global scale. So just to illustrate the problem, this is the Charleston, South Carolina area. And specifically, this is Charleston, and around here, the suburbs. And these are elevation maps according to SRTM and the LiDAR elevation model. And it becomes really clear to see the error, especially, you know, around here. Like this is a lot of vegetated, this is suburbs, but also a lot of trees and such. So the elevations are estimated to be much higher. And there's big consequences, like I said, when it comes to actually assessing what's vulnerable. So here is an area about measuring elevations about 1 meter above sea level, and SRTM is predicting much less vulnerability than LiDAR. And just as another visualization of this, is like a kind of 3D representation, Charleston, Tampa, and Brisbane, Australia, LiDAR versus SRTM. You can, you know, it's plain to see, you know, with this kind of erratic, noisy elevation data, it's kind of going to dramatically underpredict the possible vulnerability. So here we make the assumption that the errors present in SRTM can be modeled as a function of some number of variables. Here we use we kind of construct a 23 variable error function. And I'll get into details later about what that includes. But if we have many examples of known errors, then we can use regression analysis to kind of construct this error function. And here we're making the assumption that LiDAR derived elevation data is our ground truth, because since it's so accurate. And so the SRTM minus LiDAR represents like a true error. The problem is that the error surface is like very nonlinear with respect to the variables, and just there's a huge number of variables here. So we found using a multi-layer perceptron neural network to build the regression model could give us really nice results. So to detail some of these inputs that we're feeding, the first 18 actually come from the elevation model itself. The first 9, imagine, so here what we're feeding in is given an input pixel from SRTM, what is the error at the pixel, right? So the first 9 inputs into the neural network is essentially a 3x3 window about that target point. And the second 9 inputs is we essentially downsample the SRTM DEM from 1 arcsecond to 3 arcsecond, you know, pixel width, and feed that 3x3 window of that into the neural network. So that's like a wider window, giving the neural network just a wider spatial scale to look at. And So that's actually, yeah, that's the majority of the inputs right there. Then we also, we know that the errors are affected by land slope, because if you imagine if they beam down, you know, the radar signals beam down and they hit a place with, you know, the land slope is very high, that doesn't get reflected very well. And so there's greater area there. So we kind of use a 7-tap filter to compute the angle of inclination, feed that into the neural network. Another problem with SRTM is that in the course, well, it's a satellite, right? And over the course of the mission, it became kind of, it got kind of wobbly. So they had to constantly readjust it using these kind of like micro adjustments, but tiny little adjustments to the satellite could create like multi-meter errors in the elevation model. So that creates this kind of, they call it striping artifacts. And to estimate these errors, we use data from NASA's ICESat mission, which here they sent another satellite up, then they used a laser altimeter to measure land elevations using a laser, but here it's not like an elevation model where you have like a full map. It's more just like a straight like line path across Earth's surface. But we can kind of use that to estimate these kind of localized errors at like 1 degree cells. So that's another input. And finally, a few more data sets include, so the errors are correlated with population density in cities. So we use a global scale population density map, feed that in. The errors are correlated with trees and vegetation, so vegetation density, and canopy height is like the heights of the trees in the area where there is vegetation. So we use a multi-layer perceptron artificial neural network, and we use 3 hidden layers. As I mentioned, our ground truth is the error estimated through using the LiDAR data. In the US, this comes from NOAA's digital coast, which in fact has about a 10 centimeter like RMSE error, but this is, you know, orders of magnitude more accurate than SRTM. So we just treat it as ground truth. Now the SRTM is global, right? So they've, in truth, they have elevations between, you know, all the way up to thousands of meters above above sea level. But given our interest is in the coastal vulnerability, we only are looking at areas between 1 and 20 meters, according to SRTM. Our training set includes 42 million points in the US. We had some noise to the inputs to help prevent overfitting. After the model is trained, we run through every coastal pixel in the 120 meter SRTM in the world. So we evaluated the results using the NOAA's digital coast in the US, but we also evaluated in Australia. We did not train the model in Australia, so that was very important to kind of help alleviate like overfitting concerns. And we also, over the following years, it was evaluated in a few other locations as well. So what we see is that the mean bias, you know, in the US, the mean bias is over 3.5 meters. That's virtually eliminated. In Australia, it went from 2.5 meters to, you know, about negative 11 centimeters. Puerto Rico, we didn't, I mean, that's part of the US, but we didn't train in Puerto Rico, and that, you know, brought down to almost nothing. And same with Bahamas. So this was very exciting. The RMSEs, like the air scatter, was cut by about a third to a half in most places. And LE90 and LE95, the linear errors were also greatly reduced. So here we have just a visualization of how errors change. So according to the different variables. So the red is the original, blue is coastal dam. So in each of these graphs, as I said, like the population density, slope, local ISI error, they're all correlated with errors in SRTM. And these are almost, across the board kind of flatline now in both the US and Australia. These are error maps. If this is Charleston again, this is Brisbane, Australia, from -20 to the +20 meters. Again, we see between SRTM and coastal dam, a dramatic reduction in that those high error regions in both locations. And bringing back these visualizations, we can kind of see the result, right? So instead of these little mountains in these caused by the buildings, they're all kind of flattened out. I mean, it's not perfect, right? The coastal dam is still kind of underestimating a little bit but much better than SRTM. Using those ISAT deviations again, we can kind of use those to assess the errors at global scale. Now, the problem is the ISAT data is actually very, very noisy itself, and it actually has about a 1 meter bias. But we found that, just visually it looks much better, right? Especially in the Southeast Asia, Indonesia. And overall, across all these cells, it reduces bias by close to 2 meters. So next we come to the actual coastal vulnerability assessment. That is, we're using the elevation models to predict like how many people, like where and how many people are vulnerable to coastal flooding. So first, I'm not going to get into the weeds here, but essentially we're converting each of the elevation models to reference the high tide line. So the pixel values, measure the altitude above the local high tide line. And then we can threshold the elevations to like the sea level rise projections and also the annual flood heights to generate the inundation surface flood maps. I'm going to use annual flood a lot in the coming slides, but really what this means is the height of a coastal flood that occurs on average once a year. Sometimes it'll occur 2 or 3 times a year. Other years it won't happen at all, but this is an average annual flood. We use connected components analysis to remove isolated low-lying areas. We don't incorporate any coastal defenses like levees or anything like that because we don't have that data globally. And we integrate these flood surfaces with land masks and population density maps to compute exposure. So this is actually a screenshot from our website, coastal.climatecentral.org. And you can compare, this is land below the projected annual flood level in 2050 in Bangkok, Thailand. So red areas represent areas that are estimated to be hit by flooding on average once a year. Or at least I should say, they're land lower than I shouldn't say that they are land predicted to be hit by flooding. It's more that they are on land low enough to potentially be hit by flooding. I'll get into that limitation later. But anyway, the important point here is, coastal dam predicts a dramatically lower and more vulnerable land in this area. You can kind of see that SRTM, like you can almost see the outline of what it really should be, but due to the density of buildings here, it's kind of it doesn't capture that. Mumbai, India, very similar. Like it doesn't really, yeah, SRTM doesn't really see any of this land as low-lying. Bangladesh is a big one. Bangladesh is just covered by no vegetation and trees. And errors in SRTM are very, very, very high. And so coastal dam helps to flatten that out. Vietnam, same thing. It's very densely populated with a lot of vegetation. So SRTM really struggles with that. And again, this is all our website, which anyone can access. We use Google Earth Engine to generate these maps dynamically on the fly, and we have a bunch of settings like different projections and year pollution scenarios and so on. So I invite you to check that out. Now this is a map of the relative increase of predicted exposure according to coastal dam over SRTM. So in other words, so in China, for example, there's about 3 times more exposure estimated. Down in South Asia, it's as much as like 7, 8, 9x. Parts of Africa, the same. In terms of total numbers, China kind of dominates, unfortunately. With this is again, yeah, average annual flood in 2050. So we're predicting 93 million people in China could be vulnerable, which is, yeah, 67 million people more than previously thought. Bangladesh, we saw what a big difference, how different the map looks, and that's 42 compared to 5 million, and so on down the line. Looking at these are the global populations below the high tide. So this is the best possible case. This is no annual flood. This with low emissions, so this is basically the people who are projected to be under the coming high tide line. Now, so by 2100, it hits an estimate of 190 million, which is about 3 times. But basically, across the board, global numbers are about 3 times higher than what SRTM predicts. This is an interesting one. This is 2000, so this is the estimated number of people under the high tide line today. The reason why there's like both SRTM and coastal dam predict a lot today. Again, we don't consider any coastal defenses, so both these DEMs kind of see like all of Louisiana is underwater and all of the Netherlands is underwater, and like today, which is not realistic. So that's but on the other hand, due to the rising sea levels, all of these protections that are built now will have to be continue to be maintained and built higher to continue protecting their populations. Now this is kind of the worst case scenario. This is the annual flood height, assuming no cuts to emissions, and also assuming that the Antarctic ice sheets are like doomed to collapse. So here, this is the number of people today that are under the projected to be under the annual flood height. It's 250 million people, and by 2100, it's we estimate about 500 million people could be under this threshold. As a kind of validation, we do these assess exposure using LiDAR and coastal dam and SRTM and a couple other elevation models. And here, the pink, this is 0 means no error. -1 means 0 expected exposure. And yeah, so yeah, across the board in almost every state, US state and US and Australia, and every elevation or every elevation threshold, coastal dam does appears to do a lot better than the others in terms of predicting exposure, but it's still underestimating, interestingly, by over half in the 1 meter and 2 meter case. It does better at 3 meters though. So limitations, very important. There's still a lot of even though it's a lot better, there's still a lot of error. Like there's still considerable error compared to LiDAR. And this is much more sensitive at smaller spatial scales like cities or small islands. And it's right now it's kind of difficult to assess error in countries without that LiDAR derived elevation data. Now we're not suggesting again that the cities are going to be like wiped out or anything, like, or that hundreds of millions of people will move. Like I said, we don't consider any defenses right now, and we are already predicting that today 110 million people are living under the current high tide line. Our model also doesn't consider any, it's like a bathtub model, meaning it's not like hydrodynamic model. Like the exposure may be actually quite less, because especially the thing about that Bangladesh map, it looks like half the country's under the annual flood height, but by 2050. But in reality, there's like wave attenuation and such that's going to bring that down. So we don't consider that in this work. And there's other sources of error like the population model and so on that are important. So yeah, to include the we're kind of hoping that this elevation model kind of inspires countries to release and collect their LiDAR elevation data, better elevation data. We're kind of hoping that this shows how important this elevation data is to understanding coastal vulnerability. And in fact, actually, we're making improvements to this day on coastal dam, actually coming soon. This is actually in the next few months, we're going to be releasing the next version of coastal dam, trained on much newer ISAT data instead of the US LiDAR data. So it's going to be trained on data globally with new input variables. And here we're actually using convolutional neural network, which due to computational resources, we weren't able to do for our first coastal dam 1. And just as a preview of the results, this is the coastal dam 1. This is RMSE, so error. So the RMSEs are generally cut by a third compared to coastal dam 1, especially like in Africa, South America, Asia. So we're excited about that. And these are global estimates, especially here. These are in the estimates of error in the low-lying populated areas, comparing coastal dam 2 versus 1. So yeah, these are the bias and RMSE. So yeah, we're excited about these results. Yeah, and just as a quick touch on a couple of our other projects that we're working on, as Kelton mentioned, we just had published a paper in Nature Communications looking at how. So from the Industrial Revolution, there's already been about 10 centimeters of sea level rise due to human-caused carbon emissions, and we used hydrodynamic simulations to simulate Hurricane Sandy as it happened versus what it could have looked like without that sea level rise. And we applied a damage model to it, and we found about $8 billion or 13% of the total damage caused by the flooding in Sandy was likely directly caused by this human-caused sea level rise. So I bet you check that out. And finally, one more thing to keep an eye on is my other big project is this flood vision. This is here we're using photo and LiDAR data taken from the top of cars to build, given a photo, and we use a convolutional neural network to build a 3D reconstruction of each photo. And then we can take like a flood forecast or sea level rise projection, so on, and model like an actual flood layer through that. And this is, we published this prototype in Weather and Climate Extremes. But later this year, we're coming out with a much better looking and much bigger scale version of this. So I invite you to keep an eye out for that as well. So that concludes my talk.
Great. So we're just going to transition now to Q&A, but thanks so much, Scott, for the sort of eye-opening talk, and transition over here. Definitely a lot to unpack, I think, between both talks and both presenters. So certainly, I think we'll just dive into some of the questions. And I want to remind everyone that some of these questions have been asked and entered in advance from people who registered for the event. And then we're also going to be sort of parsing through the questions that have been posted in the chat. Feel free to add additional questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So we'll dive right into things and kick it off. Both presentations implied that large coastal populations may be exposed to flooding to a greater extent than one would have concluded previously, relying on standard measures from tidal gauges in the case of Dr. Moore's talk, and satellite digital elevation models in the case of Dr. Kolp's talk. Since these standard tidal gauge and digital elevation data are presumably widely used in coastal decision-making, what are the implications of your findings for local adaptation planning for the locations where your augmented measures differed the most from what data previously suggested? Has your large-scale research translated to any local action or realizations? Starting with Dr. Moore.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so I think, exactly how these coastal, I think, it would be nice to think of these coastal protections as like a kind of rational, forward-looking agent, like making them. And then when you dig into how they're actually made, there's a lot of path dependency, there's a lot of politics, there's a lot of like questions about like what determined, a lot about the institutional and property rights distribution that determines who is able to protect what areas and why. And so, the extent to which, these decisions are not relying on, different types of, tide gauge or sea level rise projections, I don't know. And I think it would probably vary a lot from location to location and institution to, like is Army Corps of Engineers doing something really different from like City of Miami or like a homeowner on like the Oregon coast, right? Who's thinking about protecting their property. So I think that's a whole like interesting question in general about how like, flood defenses, which are, in certain types of them are kind of characteristic public goods, right? Other types are like more private, right? If I'm a coastal homeowner, I can, do some stuff to like protect my own home, potentially at the expense of my neighbors. So like there's a lot of interesting economics and politics there. For this in particular, like the study I presented that we have results from already, I think it's really too early to, for us to be going out to like tell cities they should be relying on it. But the hope is that like if we could do something, the kind of what I described at the end, like I think there's real potential there in terms of being able to inform cities about, if we can generate these really tailored models of what drives urban flooding in a particular city, whether that's coastal or whether it's certain types of rainfall events or those interactions, then that could be really informative for cities. And I do think that if what cities like, they like having data that is from their city, right? They like being able to say that this is like, this is not like some national model and you're just like, but like actually this is like all about, our local area because, everyone is like special and like different, right? And distinct, which is true, right? To a large extent. And like with this type of approach that we could really do that. And so I do hope it kind of goes in that direction, but we're definitely not there yet.
Thanks. Yeah, and it also seems like certainly in the paper, the outliers that you identified might be like a starting point, that there are certain places which are socially reacting to remarkable flooding events that aren't registered by the tidal gauges. And that might be at least like the initial starting point to see if there's some disconnect. So yeah, we'll pivot that same question for Dr. Kolp. Just to kind of recap a little bit, has your kind of large scale research translated to any local action or realizations? What are the implications of your findings for local adaptation planning?
That's a good question. I mean, so a couple of things. Has it done action? So the paper has received a lot of attention internationally. It's been written about in I think a few thousand newspapers around the world. And so we are getting the word out. And right now, I couldn't tell you exactly if there's been any direct action by those local policymakers around the world. I do know, though, that the response has been interesting. Like, we've gotten a lot of positive response from the actual people and scientists and the users of her website, but it's the local governments actually that are not as happy with us. In fact, we got they are just I think the people, when they discover that their land is much more vulnerable than they thought to sea level rise and flooding, they are demanding that action be taken from their policymakers to help improve their protections. And that puts pressure, and it just puts those local policymakers in an uncomfortable position. So that was our greatest source of pushback so far, has been those governments. But can you repeat the second part of your question?
Yeah, no, I think you actually touched on both,
Okay.
which was kind of like the implications of it for local planning. And I think, just kind of in the interest of time, since we have a lot of questions, we'll move on to the next one, which is directed to Dr. Moore. So even though machine learning has been in the limelight, your research shows how social information arising from human learned responses can become a valuable signal for monitoring flooding. Is there a risk, however, that human learning, fallible as it is, may mask the extent of increased flooding that gradually becomes a normal part of the landscape or local life? Is it possible, in other words, from the social media data you use to distinguish normalization of more frequent floods from actual adaptation to their impacts?
Yeah, that's a really excuse me. That's a really good question. And so, with Nick Obradovich and some other co-authors previously, we used Twitter data to kind of quantify the phenomenon of normalization of kind of chronic changes in environmental conditions. And so it's certainly something, this idea that like, well, the same flood, people might just stop tweeting about it, right? Because if they experience it, like the same flood every month. It's definitely something we're aware of. And we looked into whether we could identify that effect specifically in the data set. The original Twitter data was really too short. What's distinct from temperature is temperature, you have this like really, really strong seasonal effect, right? Where you have effectively a lot more data because people's expectations about temperature in a certain time of year are like different, right? Because people have like, don't expect the temperature in March to be the same as November. So that means within every year you have like 50 weeks, right? Whereas we really like, that's not the case in with flooding. Like the model of it is just different. And so you actually need to look at like the frequency of floods changing in a particular place and how that then translates into how people tweet about them. And that is like, you just don't have long enough record for in any given place to really be able to say that the flood frequency has changed enough that we'd really expect people to change that tweeting pattern. But it's certainly something that's a concern. Like if you were to like rely on this type of metric in like over a very long time period, yeah, it would be but the other issue too is like, well, cities are responding, right? So like Miami had like a big project to protect a bunch of streets, right? And so that's an adaptation, right? We'd expect that to show up in the frequent, for a given driver, for a given tide height, for a given, like rainfall event, right? We should get fewer tweets about that in Miami because they've taken steps to like lower the consequences of that. And so understanding what we're measuring as this integrated measure of like exposure and consequence, with an asterisk that we have to be concerned about some normalization effects going on, I think is like helpful for kind of understanding what's going on.
Certainly. And so we'll move on to the next question, which is targeted for or addressed to Dr. Kolp. So coastal DIM is referenced to the EGM 96 GeoID, I believe, which has been improved on in more recent years in the case of EGM 2008 and the forthcoming EGM 2020. It seems like for vulnerability analysis, some low-hanging fruit might be to convert elevations to a more accurate GeoID model. Have you considered that in coastal DIM? Seems like this would be separate from the neural net model, but maybe a useful conversion. Or is there a reason one wouldn't want to do this?
That's an interesting question, and it's a great question. So here's the thing about the EGM 96, well, the EGM 91s. Yeah, they are geodetic models, meaning they model like the zero gravitational potential. So, but what they do not model are things. So it's like it's modeling what the sea level rise would be without any kind of like water motion or dynamic effects like that. But it does not take into account things like ocean currents or just like the local topography that kind of can change what the local sea levels, like the local high tide lines, look like. So that is why we work really hard to convert our model from EGM 96 to the local mean higher, basically the local high tide line.
Excellent. And so I guess we have like a natural rhythm going here. This next question is targeted for Dr. Moore, and it's actually, we're going to try to kind of pack together two questions, so bear with me. As your study illustrates in the case of tidal gauges, most environmental data sources have blind spots in terms of spatial coverage. While social media data may complement tidal gauge data in certain populated locations, what are some of the potential limitations of employing social media data in terms of its demographic social coverage? Might certain flooding events be less remarked about by certain well-represented communities on Twitter, yet more remarkable to underrepresented communities? Scenario of data collection gap from social media itself due to the flooding or any other situation. So for example, people may not be able to post things when in an emergency scenario because they lose connection or the power goes down.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And so I kind of flagged this in my talk that we could get into some of the pitfalls of Twitter data too. So the first question on the demographics, so I was looking into this recently for my grant proposal that was rejected actually yesterday. So the Pew Center has a study on the demographics of Twitter users, right? And how they compare to the US. And I was actually really surprised to see that on a racial basis, on a gender basis, there's actually very little difference, right? So Twitter users are pretty representative. They tend to be on average younger, slightly younger, but like there's still a range, right? Like I think people have this idea that like, oh, it's teenagers using Twitter, right? And like that is not true. Teenagers are on like different apps to start with. And also there's like a much wider range of people, right? So there's plenty of like 50 plus kind of people on Twitter. They tend to be much slightly wealthier, although again, there's like a broad range. And they tend to be on average slightly more liberal, although that's obviously correlated with age as well. Those factors are also correlated with living in an urban area, right? So if you start to focus instead on like these areas where Twitter is better, right? You have a much higher density of people who are tweeting about a certain city, right? And that is by nature, like where you're going to get more information from this data source, right? Like it starts to look less like unrepresentative, like along those metrics, than than if you compare to the whole like US population on average. I think the issue of like racial demographics, racial representation is particularly important because we know that US housing is like super segregated by race, right? In ways that we would expect could well map on to flooding vulnerability. And so if you really saw like, a divergence between like the populations on Twitter, the kind of racial makeup, then you'd be really worried you might be missing floods in kind of minority neighborhoods if they're like underrepresented on Twitter. They're like, we don't have that much evidence on the demographics on Twitter, but it's like, it seems like that's less of a concern. One of the extensions I want to do is actually to look at everything we've done so far with English language tweets. I want to do something with Spanish language tweets for areas that have large Hispanic populations and kind of compare the difference, as a way of trying to get, like, we're kind of limited in exactly, we have very little information about the demographics of the users in our sample, specifically, but there's kind of ways you could start to indirectly get at some of those differential exposure effects.
Thanks so
sorry,
much.
that was a demographics piece. Was there a second piece to that question?
I think there was just maybe one related piece, which was less risk of systematic bias, but maybe a risk of like major events that knock out power could curtail the sort of availability and access to social media.
Yeah, so I'm less worried about that for this app. So people have also used social media as a kind of real-time monitoring and event response, right? So there's like papers about, can you use it to kind of quickly target like hurricane relief or like earthquake relief? And that I think is more of a concern in those cases. What we're really trying to get here is these like minor, like annoying floods, right? And like, if you have a flood that's so large that it's really knocking out power to large segments of the population, then there's going to be other ways to like capture that, and it's going to show up in like news media reports and stuff. So I think we're trying to get a handle on these much more like minor events that are like, I think that's less of a concern.
Excellent. Thanks for being candid about that. And it's of course always important to kind of scrutinize any data set, and social media provides some advantages over other data sets, but also has limitations like any data set. And it sounds like I think your paper highlights how these sort of data sets can complement each other in certain regards. So moving over to Dr. Kolp, we have a question which is kind of related to one of the previous questions, but I think extends in an interesting direction. So SRTM does indeed overestimate elevation due to its resolution, which is 90 meters. So what LiDAR does, it simply downscales elevation to a finer resolution, but it does not eliminate the problem of buildings and high structures. Have you considered using perhaps satellite images alongside LiDAR data to see how these areas actually flood? So actually using the sort of raw imagery from satellite.
Right. So, well, a couple of things. Actually, LiDAR is actually a lot better than you might think, because yeah, it's true if they shoot a laser, when they shoot a laser at the building, it'll bounce off the building. But what happens is if you look at the photon returns from the LiDAR beam, yeah, there's actually like if you look at the distribution of the photon returns, there's in areas with like buildings or trees, like you can imagine like the laser going through like between the tree leaves. There's like basically it's like a bimodal distribution where you have like two humps, and basically what they do is they take like the lower, they basically remove those the higher higher bumps, those higher peaks, and take the lower ones, and that way they do in fact get the bare earth elevations this way. And then I think NOAA also does a lot of pre-processing to in areas where they know that it's hitting buildings. They might do things like interpolation, like if they have like a building and they might have the elevation for the building itself, but they have all the land around it, they might interpolate to get the land elevation there. So like if you recall from those 3D visualizations, I presented to the LiDAR versus SRTM. It's in Charleston and all those cities. It's pretty flat with the LiDAR data. You don't see all those little peaks. So yeah, the LiDAR is quite good. Now, that said, have we considered using the satellite LiDAR to see how these, or satellite images to see how these areas actually flood? This is a great idea. We haven't done it ourselves. I think this is, I mean, it's a great validation. It's kind of hard. And also, my prediction is if we tried that, we would see less exposure than what even like the LiDAR predicts, because as I mentioned before, like we use a bathtub model, meaning we don't take into account like the actual dynamics of the water. So we don't like, imagine like a water coming in, it's like hitting buildings and trees and stuff. It's going to slow down the water, and it's going to take longer to fill up the vulnerable areas. So yeah, that would be my prediction of what we would see. So our estimates were more like a first order estimate to kind of screen areas that are potentially vulnerable to flooding.
Great. And a follow-up question there. So coastal defenses and population changes were not considered in estimating future exposures. Speculatively speaking, is there a role for machine learning and artificial intelligence in simulating plausible development scenarios on a more granular level than currently permitted by the shared socioeconomic pathways and RCPs?
Another very good question. I mean, I could imagine if you had a data like, yeah, I think you have some countries and places with better records of where their defenses are. And if I bet you could find a way to use machine learning to kind of use those to predict, other areas where protections are likely to be. Keeping in mind that more the countries where the areas with such data are probably more wealthy and probably have better protections than areas without that data available. Just off the top of my head is my guess. But no, it's a great idea.
Great. And so I think we are down to the last 3 minutes. So we have one of the concluding questions here, and I think this is addressed to both speakers. So perhaps we can kind of end with this and a bit of a conversation between the speakers. And so from both of your perspectives, what opportunities are there for machine learning to contribute to coastal adaptation research? Likewise, are there specific questions that you believe machine learning is ill-suited for answering in this context? And I guess maybe starting with Dr. Moore.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I have a great, you warned me about this question, so I should have a better answer. But, well, I think, I think, is it like the method? Like, to me, it's always the question, right? And then like, there's a whole range of tools that are available to answer that question. And like machine learning is like a powerful tool, is particularly powerful given like the more data we have. And in some contexts, that's going to, particularly where we're trying to do kind of prediction, or kind of learn something about these complex systems. I think it's going to be useful, but again, like, you run into like these old problems when it comes to adaptation in coastal areas, which is politics, which is the same problem you run into with mitigation. And, kind of there's value, I think, in informing some of those decisions. And, I think what Scott presented with Climate Central's work of like, informing people about what their risk is in this very accessible way is like one way of like changing those politics, which is why he's getting pushback from local governments. But yeah, I think it's a tool, it's a good tool, but I don't think it really changes some of these fundamental kind of political, economic issues around adaptation, and particularly coastal adaptation. This is public good in a lot of cases. that I described, and it's like difficult to provide public goods even at the best of times, right? And yeah, sorry, that was like super vague.
It's a big open-ended question. So Dr. Kolp, do you have any thoughts on basically what some of the opportunities are for using machine learning to contribute to coastal adaptation research, and what some of the sort of maybe limitations are in terms of what it cannot answer?
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with what Dr. Moore said. I mean, I think I see machine learning being most valuable in identifying where maybe adaptation would be most useful. But yeah, as Dr. Moore said, I mean, just that it's the actual doing it that's, I don't know how you're going to use machine learning in the actual application, like when you're, if you, yeah, in the actual the logistics of all that. But I don't know. I also, I know I would hate to, I hate saying that there's no way of using machine learning in such applications. I mean, that seems kind of short-sighted in a way. Of course, maybe people more clever than I could, find ways to use this tool.
Can I add
solve these
a
problems.
addendum onto my response? So
Please do.
I do think in terms of, I kind of like mentioned at the end of my talk that like, to the extent you have these like highly localized like phenomena that are dependent on like kind of really high like local characteristics, that it does provide this ability to provide this tailored information in a like cost-effective way, right? That like not everyone's going to go out and commission like, a team of scientists to build like a really like detailed like say like commute like a transport network model, right, for that city, right? But you're because the cities are just too small, they can't afford it, right? Like, so like you could provide, like, I think it is a way of providing this like scalable yet tailored information that if it's transparent and trustworthy, and that's kind of like clearly communicated, it could provide the basis for some kind of, some useful products to cities to like kind of to make some of these decisions.
Excellent. I think that is a perfect note to conclude on. And I just wanted to probably echo all of our attendees and thanking both of you for sharing so many insights and candid reflections on your work. I want to remind everybody that we will have the next webinar already next month. So go to the CCAI website and register now. And this webinar, as well as the others, are posted there too. So if you want to revisit discussions today, feel free to do so. And with that, thanks everybody for joining, and let's all give a virtual round of applause to Dr. Moore and Dr. Kolp. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.